Hi, my name is David Wetton and welcome to the Conscious Leadership Now podcast. The intent of this podcast is to encourage you as a leader to embrace conscious leadership by giving you access to some of the world's leaders in the field of conscious leadership, both in practice and in thought. My heartfelt wish is that you leave this podcast feeling inspired with ideas to take away and implement in your business or organization to make a real difference in our world. And my guest today is Lorraine Flower.
Hi, David.
Hi, Lorraine, and welcome.
Thank you.
For Lorraine, a growing calling to bring the power of spirituality and consciousness into the business world led her to choosing to cut short a high-flying and diverse corporate career at the age of 38 that changed the whole trajectory of her life. Instead of continuing to buy into the traditions of business, Lorraine spent the last 20 years translating spiritual principles into a language and ethos that can be heard in the most traditional of business. And as a corporate change agent, consultant, coach and mentor, Lorraine founded Azzur, being completely transparent about the spiritual principles on which it operates and has worked with clients across the business spectrum. Lorraine brings 20 years service industry experience to bear through her senior leadership roles at British Airways and Great North Eastern Railway. It's Lorraine's belief in individual and organisational power for good that gives Azzur its raison d'etre, an organisational development consultancy beyond the conventional, energising the heart of your business. She's lectured at universities and set up the Foundation for Workplace Spirituality, supported the International Conference on Organisational Spirituality, led by Surrey University, and she leads the Azzur Conscious Leadership and Organisational team, runs consciousness retreats, blogs extensively, and is currently co-authoring her second book. She works and studies extensively in developing and exploring conscious leadership, believing that business leaders are key players in transforming the well-being of planet and humanity as a whole. And Lorraine wrote in her recent article, Leading Towards a Higher Purpose, as leaders of organisations, the time is here now for us to take a long, hard look at the purpose of our organisation and to ask ourselves whether it is truly serving the achievement of a better world for all. And Lorraine, what a great way to start a conscious leadership discussion. And it's wonderful to have you on the show. And I'm really looking forward to a fabulous conversation.
Yeah, me too, David. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Listening to that is, well, okay.
Starts up a great conversation, I believe. So, Lorraine, Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet is my cue that it's time for you to take 5. Your take on 5 conscious leadership questions. So my first question is, what does conscious leadership mean to you?
Well, David, I think the first thing I want to say about that is about how I show up. Mm-hmm. So when I think about it in terms of my own personal responsibility as a conscious leader, it's about thinking each day, each moment of each day, about who is in the current moment, what part of me is showing up. And that's not because I'm perfect or manage to crack that every second of the day, but that's kind of an underpinning aspect for me of conscious leadership. How I show up, I mean, am I coming from a space that is filled with love, filled with compassion, filled with understanding, and also one where I can see others beyond myself. So how I show up is a key part of it. Another part for me of conscious leadership is about perspective. I think one of the challenges of our world today is that there's a lot of pressure on people to be quite insular in many ways, to be concerned with their own lives and with their own needs. And this is legitimate and fair. But from a conscious leadership perspective, we have to elevate and expand that and try and see beyond our immediate issues and out into a wider perspective as far as we can possibly go, community, way on out into the global perspective and even the cosmological perspective. And then the third aspect for me about conscious leadership is links really to the principle of unity, being able to see that we are all part of one whole entity, that we are interconnected. And recent events are showing us the truth of that in a whole number of different ways, but within that unity also being able to respect individual diversity and difference. So yeah, I think these are three of the things that stand out for me in terms of conscious leadership and how I particularly seek to practice it.
Thank you, Lorraine, and I really appreciate you talking about being present and being in the moment. I guess what some would speak about, I guess almost through emotional intelligence, this self-awareness of where you are. Do you have any examples of that where you as a conscious leader, how you bring this self-awareness maybe to either your organization or to your clients?
Yeah, I think as someone who spends a lot of time working with groups of leaders and so on, it can be quite interesting to see the dynamics of how groups play out, particularly with the work that we're doing, which is hopefully helping them to take some steps forward in their collective performance and collective impact and relationships. And the dynamics can sometimes be quite challenging. And as a facilitator, it can be tempting to consider one's own success or otherwise as solely a function of oneself. But if we see ourselves as part of the whole and feel the dynamic of that group, feel the energy of that group, hold a higher perspective for that group in terms of an aspiration for where it can get to, we become less ego focused. So it's less about did I do a good job, did I do a rubbish job, did I touch all the right buttons, but being fully present with the group and really one doesn't blend with it, but one is very aware of the dynamics on a different level. So it's about recognizing roles and functions, but also that it's not all about me. It's about what the group needs to unfold in that sense.
I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you. And I really have that sense of, you answered late, secondly, I gave a quote from it, didn't you, about talking about a better world for all. And as you were speaking there, I had a sense of, and I think you've probably come across the work of Frederick Laloux and his organization, which is great. Of course, what came to mind is maybe, when we're talking about what conscious leadership means to you, it's very much had a sense of you holding a space for the group. And obviously Laloux speaks about emergence, doesn't he? What's seeking to emerge.
Yeah. And this is, this whole concept of emergence it's language that's coming more to the fore now, I think, and people are starting to explore it a little bit. I mean, it's been around for many years. If you look at systems theory and chaos theory and all of those, and in fact, if you go into quantum physics, for example, one can see the natural world playing this out. For us as human beings, it's a much harder concept because we are pretty addicted to the idea of control. Yes. Of course, it is an idea rather than necessarily a fact, but we nevertheless like to persuade ourselves that we have some level of control. But this idea of emergence does, as Laloux speaks about, and as many are exploring, requires us to show up and be present with what is actually happening. And to be able to hold that, we've got to expand our own inner leadership, if I can describe it that way. So we've got to be able to expand our heart, expand our world vision, as I said, but also expand our relationship with the self, with others, with whatever the question or issue is that we're holding. We've got to get into relationship with things in a different way, and this is quite tough for leaders in organizations because it's a much more transactional culture and context, generally speaking.
Well, thank you for that, and I think it's really important for me to kind of listen to that position on conscious leadership, because I think having been in the corporate world myself for quite a long period of time, it's very easy, and myself included, to get pulled into this transactional way of doing things, which includes, going to meetings with a set agenda, with a set outcome in mind, which is why I kind of just teased out emergence, because quite often some of the best meetings I've been to have come with ideas or direction which has emerged, which wasn't perhaps identifiable at the start of the meeting. So
yeah, and I mean, I've had actually more recently, which is fabulous, but more recently I've had situations where I've prepared, whatever one does professionally, prepare a whole host of ideas, material. Well, we can do this, we'll do that, whatever. And literally, I'm thinking of one situation. I've done all that preparation. We were going to be together for a day. I was with this group doing some ongoing work, and literally nothing that I had prepared was what we actually did on the day. And it was literally working in the moment with the group and trusting that we together would work out what needed to be done and be present with what needed to come into the conversation and into the ultimate conclusions that were drawn from that. But so as someone who is in that sort of facilitator role, sometimes I tend to use the word focalizer, because for me, it's also about being with the energy and the being able to see the way in which energy is moving, as well as the sort of physical, practical aspects of any discussion. We ourselves have to be prepared to stand in that space and feel a little more vulnerable than perhaps we professionally feel comfortable. And if we notice that vulnerability, then that's what we're now starting to connect with when we're helping others to find their conscious leadership legs or heart or head.
That's wonderful, thank you. And my next question, which I think we've already kind of moved into, is how do you express conscious leadership through your work?
Well, I mean, through the essence of the work as a facilitator, as someone who's working in that change agency space, we tend to obviously try and work with as much as possible whatever is present in the given space. And that's not to say there aren't times when we're doing something that's slightly more structured or formal, but it is about trying to be present. I think the other key word, and I'm sure this comes up quite a lot in the conscious leadership space, is the one of bridging. So in other words, recognizing that some of the things that leaders do hopefully pay a bit of attention to, which is things like values and culture and behaviors and purpose. This language is starting to become more common currency in organizational life. And like so many things, there are many, many layers to it. So our role is to try and deepen that relationship with those elements and not have them be just perhaps a bit more superficial, but to kind of really get into the substance of any of those areas and help them to land in a more heartfelt way rather and a truer way than kind of compliance, which can sometimes be motivation.
It is. So how, and I'm going to ask you, because I think that's really important, so thank you for raising that point, actually almost interlinking those areas. You talk about how we're interconnected, as an organization, as a community, as a world, and kind of interlinking, I think, those key elements. So I just wanted to ask you, actually, because you brought up the issue of values, and I see, through your website, you have some lovely values, loving, passionate, visionary, centered in service, and courageous. So how do you express these through your work? Let's choose one. How do those serve you?
Well, let me pick the last one that you identified, the courageous one. For us, there's the constant edge, I guess, to not deny the truth of our underpinnings. So as a philosophy, as a way of informing self, it's important that we also work out how to bring that forward, both directly and indirectly. And that's not about being kind of trying to be untrue with people or in any way manipulate, but at the same time, I think we need to be able to bring some visibility to a deeper conversation. And so through blogs, through conversations with leaders, through the way we design our sessions, the content of some of our work, we try to always look at where's the edge, where could we just take this another step forward, rather than trying to be safe and conventional. So for us, in the way that we run our business, we're not pursuing profit or income at any cost, or clearly we all like to survive, we have to be able to put food on the table, but our values really have to play out in the way we work too, not just as something that is nice to put on a website, for example. So that courageous piece, the loving piece, like we're human, like most people, or all people, we hit challenges. We sometimes clients don't always behave the way we'd like them to, and so on. So we have regular meditation practice. We look to hold the highest possible connection with our clients and with ourselves, and we try to be forgiving to ourselves, but we also try to recognize that clients have all sorts of pressures and can't always engage in the work in the way that we might ideally like them to, and so on and so forth. So that's another expression of loving. We try to model the values in the way we work.
No, thank you. And that's something I wanted really to tease out for the listeners, because as you said, I think you alluded to, sometimes values appear on websites or on corporate walls. And although they have been set with the very best of intentions, they're not really truly embodied. Sometimes I go into organizations and I will ask, how are these actually embodied? And they'll be honest and say, well, David, we've put them up and we like them, but we don't really embody them. So when I heard you speaking about, courageous and that you're at the edge, I really sense that feeling of, living the values, and the clients you're working with knowing that you're willing to have this courageous conversation around the edge for them, and what that might mean for them to help them move them forward. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and just to say, I mean, it's interesting also these times that we're in at the moment. I think it's important that we keep raising some of the opportunities in any conversation to expand a person's horizons, and that's not because we know best, or each of us are having those horizons expanded if we're open to it through all sorts of conversations. But I think it's our job as change agents to not miss those opportunities when they're presented. So even if that risks as being a little bit unconventional, or maybe a lot unconventional.
It could well be, if you're asking, the question about perhaps how their presence in the business world is bringing about a better world for all. But I just think it's a great question to ask and to work with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So my next question is, Lorraine, who for you is an exemplar of embodied conscious leadership, and why?
You know what, doing a lot of research and having spent a lot of time in this area, it's quite hard to come up with a lot of great names, particularly in the business world. And I don't mean that in any sort of superior way, but just sometimes it's quite hard to get in and know them. There's lots that your listeners will have come across in other areas, I'm sure, but I've picked out a couple. One for me is a guy called Bob Chapman, who is the chief executive of an organization called Barry Waymiller. They're a US-based organization. They employ about 12,000 people. They're a family firm. They're owned, they still are owned by the original family. Gone through all sorts of challenges, so it's not been a straightforward journey. But Bob Chapman, as a leader, has focused his business ethos and his way of leadership, his leadership ethos, on what he's more recently coined human-centered leadership. And when you explore the way that he communicates and in fact he's now set up a whole kind of education program around this, but when you explore the way he communicates, the way he connects with his people, the stories he tells about his organization, it's very clear this is not just packaging, it's not just language, it's something that he truly believes and has real community and family style relationship with his employees in not literally every single one, but that's the ethos that he presents. So for me, he's someone who demonstrates humanness within the business world. And again, referring to our current times, this is some of the story that I hear around in the business world today, as people are starting to see more of their humanness being expressed.
Yes.
Through kindness, through simple things like being online and having meetings where you're in somebody's home rather than in their office. These sorts of things are all just little connecting points to heartfulness and humanness. So I picked Bob for that reason. But I've got a couple of other examples that your listeners might have heard of, might not. There's a chap called Dan Price who was in the media a few years ago because, again, as an owner of this case, a much smaller business, he noticed that some of his employees were struggling to cover their costs. Others, were putting off having families because they weren't earning enough, and so on and so forth. He did some soul searching, and he decided that he was going to establish a flat rate minimum wage right across the business, including his own. So he changed his salary from earning millions to a $70,000 salary for all, which has fundamentally changed people's lives and also the business. Not, again, a straightforward journey. It didn't come without its pain and without its consequences. But again, for me, that's an expression of wealth sharing, of equality, of full participation in business. And I think these are good examples of how we can start to change the shape and the role and the purpose of business in life.
Thank you. It's an unusual example, isn't it? And made me think actually of someone I know, Richard Pennycook, who was actually the chief exec of the Co-op,
right,
who had been through a difficult time and had done well. And actually coming out of a difficult time, he was transparent with his organisation and said, actually, it's been very difficult. It's now easier times. And he decided to take a pay cut, which had quite an impact on his staff. I went to visit the headquarters there, and but it's these sort of things, I think, that actually really do connect with people and can make a real difference.
Yeah, I mean, money is obviously a big part of everybody's life, and we could do a whole other discussion around the kind of consciousness of money, but it's a necessary part of living. And I think that wealth sharing is another one of those areas where we need to see consciousness really starting to take hold. And that's not about communist practices or any of that sort of thing, but it is about recognizing value within organizations and within our communities. And again, we're seeing some of that come through as we talk about key workers now, and their role in society. So I think there's some big questions for business to think about and for organizations to think about.
Thank you for that. I think you've really raised a good point about a conscious leader being aware of how money is distributed within his or her organization, and having that conversation, which, to use your one of yours again, is a courageous conversation to have, I think, in these times. Now, we spoke earlier about really how this conscious leadership is a journey. It's a conscious leadership journey. So I wanted to ask you, as kind of part B to this question, in your own journey, what resources have you found helpful for you?
Well, I mean, this kind of covers a whole host of different areas, but way back when I started to attend conferences on what were then called conscious business, and they happened to be in the States. That was the area where the kind of leading edge in some ways of some of this thinking. So for me, one area of resource has been in being curious, getting out and just seeing what an alternative way of being engaged in business, my role as a leader, my role as someone ultimately who's come to support leaders, and then looking for others who are doing something similar. So again, if someone were thinking of this could feel different, maybe I could be leading in a different way, look at what's out there, and there's so much out there now. But the conscious capitalism movement is pretty well advanced in certainly sharing its thinking, and not necessarily yet in terms of becoming a critical mass of businesses, but it is nevertheless well supported. So thinking about how can we engage differently, then for public resources like things like the World Economic Forum or the United Nations. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals are very provocative. They're huge, of course. They can feel a bit overwhelming as an individual. But if you take a bite of them, if you take just a piece of it and say, how does this relate to what we do as a business or what I do as a leader, that they're a great inspiration. And then there's, of course, writers, you know, people who are thought leaders in this area. And some of my biggest influences in this have been people like Meg Wheatley,
Yes.
of course, Otto Scharmer, who is doing great work through MIT and through his Theory U and presencing, and Peter Senge obviously working in that area. So there's plenty of writers that have been inspired, encouraged, and given me food for thought. You mentioned Lalou earlier, of course, the Reinventing Organisations work that he's done, which doesn't have quite the same spiritual expression as some books, but is nevertheless very real, very practical, and stretches the envelope, I think, in a way that people, again, coming back to that bridging word, that people can touch into. So these are just a few, but I mean, the list goes on.
I think actually that is one of the beauty of our times, actually, not just the internet, but I think actually the sheer depth and breadth, I think, of resources that are available. And my sense is that really, as you said, I like the idea that you said of being curious, because I think once you're curious, and we were speaking earlier, for me, how synchronicity can kick in, and you kind of almost, when you're looking, the teacher appears or the resource appears, and quite often you can find that. And I always encourage people to look for something or a way that actually resonates with them. And of course, it can be just for now, it's not forever, but I think it can make a real difference. And I think there's lots of great resources out there which you can use in your consulting, you can use in your organisation, that can really tap in and make a difference, as you've already, spoken very eloquently about.
I think one of the key aspects also within that I noticed, David, is that the more we expand our questioning, our curiosity into perhaps less conventional areas than we might otherwise, the more we get to see that we're not alone in this process. And I think this is really important when it comes to being able to provide oneself with support, but also find a genuine support network in that sense, or feel like, we're in some ways, we're quite tribal, aren't we, as human beings. We like to know that we're within a group or a club or some sort of community that feels resonant with us. And I think the more we reach out and look at what is actually going on out there, in a sense, that lifting the head above the parapet piece, this then starts to help us to question whether our own philosophy, our own belief system, our own structures, our own inner world is being honoured in the right way.
Wonderful. What a great segue you're speaking about inner world, because my next question is that research by Professor Jodie Fry of the Texas A&M University suggests that inner life or inner world is the source of conscious leadership. Where inner life is a form of spiritual contemplative practice. It could be a stillness practice, doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual, could be walking in nature, might include meditation, etc. So I just want to ask you, what practices have you found helpful in your conscious leadership journey, and why?
Well, again, my inner life, my inner spiritual life has been a core part of me, of who I am, for 25 years or more. Having been brought up a Catholic, I found myself rejecting that pretty early on, probably not as early as I would have liked, but that's because I was a good Catholic, so I didn't reject it. But nevertheless, and even though I rejected it as a formal religion, the essence of it, of course, informed a lot of my then later journey. So for me, that there has been a lot of spiritual inquiry throughout my life, and this has led to me developing my own meditation practice, in the sense, not my own as in something I've conceived, but I've got into a regular meditation practice. And I have to say that wasn't easy. It's still not easy, even today. It's not like I envy those people who can just kind of step into meditation and it's there and it's done, and they know what they're about. I have a good practice, it happens, but it's not easy, but it is incredibly powerful and nurturing. I do quite a bit of study in the spiritual space, so this also for me is a way of helping me to get perspective, to ask myself other questions, to kind of have that provocation, that leadership that comes from another space. And these days I don't describe myself as affiliated to any religion. I'm very much in the sort of spiritual space, informed by some broader spiritual philosophies. I also, over the years, have practiced things like shamanism. So I've spent a lot of we were talking earlier about, before we started the interview, about New Mexico. I spent many years traveling backwards and forwards to Arizona, doing a lot of practical shamanism work with teachers out there. Retreats are really important to me. A natural introvert, I like my own space, but I like to be able to do that also sometimes in a structured way. So I find retreats are helpful. And groups are very powerful for me. So being in group meditations are also very sustaining, very helpful. And you mentioned nature. For me, walking along the cliffs of Cornwall, for example, the coastal path in Cornwall, the number of times when I have that moment of oneness, that sense of isness, where you're not separate from anything, you just are with, you are part of that wholeness that I described earlier, that unity. So yes, nature is a very deep part of that spiritual practice for me too.
Wonderful, and thank you for sharing honestly about the meditation practice and your journey with that, because I think that's important too, because sometimes people think, well, if I'm doing a certain practice, it should all be wonderful, it should all flow, and I know you, having journeyed quite deeply with this, you will know that just in, let's take traditional Christian, particularly monasticism, they talk about it, an arid, a dark night of the soul. So at times spiritual practice can be quite difficult, and they recognize that, and they see that as part of the process.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this is where again we come back to that, the word that we've been touching back to of curiosity, because going in and exploring our inner life can feel quite exposing, can feel, can leave us feeling quite naked in some ways, and I think also people get put off by the idea that there has to be some sort of devotion. A lot of the religions are quite devotional in that sense to a god, or I think the finding your particular version of meditation or reflection or contemplation. There are so many different ways to get into that without it having to be connected to something that maybe doesn't resonate for some people in the more religious sense. So I think the really just being prepared to follow one's own inner intuition and synchronicity, as you said, because the right teacher or the right opportunity will show up once we ask the question.
Yes, it does. And I think one final thing on this one, I remember one of my mentors, which is something I've always remembered, speaking about the power of having, a spiritual practice, as you just described beautifully, and really to connect with yourself and I think help develop your self-awareness. Then he spoke about the nourishment of being part of a spiritual community then that can help you on this journey, help you at some of the difficult points. And as you said as well, there's something for me, particularly about being part of a group as well, that is nurturing. And then finally did speak about the power, and it can be at certain times of this journey, of having a mentor or a soul friend, so someone that can actually, quite often is on the journey, maybe a step ahead, who can just kind of be with you and support you as opposed to give you answers, really sort of coming back to that, hold that space for your inner life to really blossom and flourish.
Absolutely, and as a coach, as someone who works in that one-to-one space with leaders, obviously I would advocate the value of of that that resource. And as a coach, I also have my own support, that both on a spiritual level and on a practical level, but particularly on a spiritual level, having that spiritual mentor, that one-to-one space as you described. I think it's invaluable.
Thank you, and I really appreciate this conversation. Really, just getting a sense of the depth and the sort of breadth of what you're bringing into this space. That it's coming from your own presence. That actually you're holding a space for other people then to, in my words, to blossom and to bloom. And although at times I think we both say it may not be a straightforward journey, it's such a worthwhile journey. I think. Completely. Yeah. So my final question, almost a catch-all question, is give unlimited time and resources, which would be fabulous, wouldn't it? What single thing would you recommend aspiring conscious leaders to do?
For me, this comes back to being prepared to look inside our heart, because I think the heart is such a powerful guide if we truly connect with it and truly listen to it. So, but again, that it takes that willingness to step back a little bit and give oneself space to notice what the heart is saying. And again, this can sound a little bit sort of soft, or perhaps a bit lacking in structure. But when I say listen to the heart, what I'm really, or examining the heart, I'm really thinking that if we can create space for ourselves, and you talk about resources, and I think time is one of the things that gets in the way for most people, and time is a resource. It's, so often this isn't about spending money, although there are sorts of ways we can do that, but it is about giving ourselves genuine time. So that 5 or 10 minutes first thing in the morning, to just notice what your heart is saying. What do I love? What do I resonate with? What do I connect with? What do I notice in my world or in the world around me? What is it that, if I sense, and even just by sensing my heartbeat, just being aware of my heartbeat and being of the presence of that life force within me, how does that then inform? What do I notice pops in? What do I notice is catching my attention in terms of my concern or my beliefs or my values? So gentle inquiry through the heart for me is an important first step in this.
Wonderful, I love that. And it's the one, almost back to the resource question, is the one thing you would suggest they look at, or resource, or where might they start with that? Because I love the idea of.
Well, I think this comes back to noticing what gives you joy. So for some people, again, you mentioned off air that music was important to you. So it could be music that stimulates that inquiry. It could be nature, as we've touched on. So it could be that just simply going into one's own, garden, or if there's a particular flower or a plant, or a tree, even just going and being with that, or even admiring it, or taking a new look at it. So it could be through that. It could be for people who are more active in the sense they like to run or walk or whatever. It could be in the mindful practice of walking or running. And I remember, I'm not a great runner, but I do run from time to time. And I remember it happened one particular time, and it has happened sometimes since, where running is happening. And in that space, you're not doing the physical running is happening, but you're in a different relationship with yourself. There's again that sense of a different quality. So I guess what I'm saying is the heart is present in our everyday life. For some people it's dancing, for some people it's maybe art, whatever it is that gives you a little bit of joy. It may be in your children, but as soon as you feel your heart activated, trust that, and then start to open up the questions.
That's wonderful. Get a sense of leading, from the heart, leading with love. And one final synchronicity, I guess, for me is just before I came on, this podcast with you, I was just speaking to someone, and we spoke about the Martin Luther King 1964 Nobel Peace Prize speech, where, of course, he speaks about love in a very passionate way, but a sense that actually love isn't just emotional bosh. And the way he describes it is beautiful. I encourage people to look it up. But then he really says, you know, if we really believe in hope, then let's hope that the first and our last word is that our true hope lies in the power of love.
Yeah.
So thank you for, you know, setting that out around connecting with the heart. I think that's really important for a conscious leader.
Yeah, fundamental, I think.
It is. And now listeners will know that actually probably learned already that I love Columbo. And he was one of his key things actually was his just one more thing question. So I have introduced in this podcast a just one more thing. But this one is actually, you know, you've shared a lot of wisdom in our conversation. And I'm sure, you know, many people will have resonated with what you're saying. So it is an opportunity. My just one more thing question is please do share some of your own resources, some of your offerings through Azzur, which you feel will be helpful to those that are listening to this podcast, and if they'd like to learn more about you and your services.
That's great. Thanks, David. Well, of course, we have a website, so people can check out a bit more about us there, which is azzur.co.uk. We have also produced a couple of materials, resources that people might find useful. One is a very simple booklet called Pinpricks, which you can get on Amazon. It's not a heavy read in that sense, and it came about from all the blogging that we do, and we basically took a selection of the blogs and have kind of really narrowed them down to a couple of bite-sized thought ideas and created one for each week of the year. So that just is meant to be a source of provocation, source of inspiration for leaders who maybe are prepared or willing to do some of that inner searching and inner reflection. So that's one resource that could be useful. We are in July going to be launching our conscious leader qualities more publicly. We've been doing a lot of research on these over the years, and this starts with a very accessible card deck which describes the 5 qualities and is a coaching resource. The 5 qualities are not surprisingly heartfulness, which we've spoken about; purpose, which we've not spoken about quite so much today, but is fundamental; presence, which we've spoken quite a bit about; intention, what am I focused on; and also knowing, what is my intuition, what's my source of guidance. So that deck, I think, would be quite useful for people who are prepared to ask themselves some questions, because there's a lot of coaching questions in there. We also, on a more organisational level, do cultural audits inspired by the Lalou work. So we've got a mapping tool that allows us to use the combination of spiral dynamics and Lalou's work to have a look at just how an organisation is functioning, and looking at some very practical aspects of organisational life, but actually starting to get under the skin of just what's the journey that this organisation is making as a collective. So these are a few things that people might find interesting.
Wonderful, and I really encourage listeners to check those out, and I will put links below here in the podcast or the video podcast if you're actually watching this on YouTube. And actually, I did say I've got another synchronicity. We're full of synchronicities. Believe this, and this is true, actually, Lorraine. I don't realise I just had a look, but in advance of the podcast, I actually got hold of a copy of Pinpricks.
Oh wow! Okay.
And strangely enough, and you know what? I just opened it up to where I was looking at it, and it's actually opened up at the page that says "A little more love at work." So I thought I will trust this synchronicity and just end, because actually I would just echo it's a beautiful, it's almost like a cards, this book. I've had a look through it, and I think just looking at a single page really took me into a reflective space, which I would just love sharing in the workplace, even just starting a team meeting or something off with these. And I hear you about the cards, but just with this book, Pinpricks. So I'm just going to share about, because you talk about a little more love at work. So before we close, I'll share about that. You said that love makes the world of work go round too. People feel happier, more valued, and are more productive. And you say if the 4-letter word is too scary, then expressing our caring, our kindness and compassion has much the same powerful positive effect on our colleagues, the culture in which we work, and the quality of what we do, which isn't, I find that just a beautiful thread to reflect upon. So I could see myself, in a workplace, just sharing that, and even if people had a quick sharing around what that meant to them, what a great way to start a meeting or close a meeting or whatever, or even, so thank you for these sort of resources. Really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure. And as I say, if people follow the blogs, which are on LinkedIn and Facebook and various other places, and all means connect with me, then they'll automatically get them. There's more of that sort of hopefully helpful prompting that comes through those.
And so finally, Lorraine, just thank you so much for being on the show and for showing up in the world of conscious leadership in the way that you do.
Thank you, David, and thank you so much for sharing this resource with everybody, because we both believe this is the time when all leaders can step further into this space, and I think the work you're doing here is fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I just want to say actually to our listeners, if you've enjoyed this podcast and my approach to conscious leadership, then please know that I help conscious leaders develop purpose-led, high-performing leadership teams through one-to-one coaching and tailored leadership programs. And if you sense I can help you, then please look me up, David Wetton, on LinkedIn, and let's jump on a conversation together. And as listeners, I also want to say a big thank you to you. Thank you for listening to the podcast. And if you're willing, please do share a link to this podcast with those you think would truly benefit from it. And I truly believe that now is the time for conscious leadership. And with all the inspiring, heartfelt work you as listeners are doing, I have no doubt that conscious leadership will become a thriving reality, making a difference for the greater good of all. So until next time, I'll leave you with a blessing from John O'Donoghue. May the light of your soul bless the work you do with the secret love and warmth of your heart. And so it is.
And so it is.